Hello, everybody. Good to have you all here. We are continuing. Oh yeah, I'm Claire Walton, for those who don't know me, because I know there's quite a few visitors in tonight, which is brilliant. And we are continuing the I Am series that we started about 2 weeks ago, where we continue to we've looked at I am the light and I am the gate, and we are continuing to look tonight at I am the bread. Now, I will be honest and say we've not done them in order, and that's partly my fault, because when Tommy said he wasn't here, but it was communion, I said, it has to be that I am the bread then, doesn't it? And he went, oh, I suppose so. So here we are, we're on to I am the bread. I probably ought to move this, no, move it forward, Claire. Oh yeah, right. And then hopefully... Yeah, it's on. Yeah, do it, why don't you? I'll sort of do a, let's move on. Right, so next slide should say, the passage that we're looking at tonight, Jesus said, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. What a promise, huh? That's a really exciting thing to have. Right, so, bread. Next one. Yeah, right, bread. Lots of breads. I did get a little bit loopy on my my photos. I have actually made all these ones. So, quick question, quick quiz. Who's had bread today? The vast majority I'd have expected. I know there's a few who have gluten-free options and they can't necessarily have bread every day. So most of you have probably had bread. Which country in the world doesn't eat bread? None of them, indeed, none of them. Every single country eats bread. Can anyone guess the least, the ones who eat least? Anyone? No, the least is China and India. I think it's because it's per capita. They actually eat a phenomenally small amount per capita. So that's how it works. Now, if you've worked out who eats the least, who eats the most? No. He's not allowed to answer. Not the US? Nope. 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 It's Turkey. They even have a dish called Iskender, which has bread in it with the meat, and then they serve it with bread. It's really good stuff, but it is a little bit bizarre. So, he did reasonably well okay on that one. So we're going to look at how bread is made and what bread is actually made of. So hopefully the next slide. So my hope today is to try and talk about and get in your mind some of the things that we've looked at over previous times as well as today with bread. So the first main ingredient of bread is flour. Now there's lots of different types of flour. This is like your standard white. And this is the basis of most breads that you will eat. It has gluten in it, which is why a lot of people can't, if they're gluten intolerant, can't eat it. But it is the basis of bread. Now, many of you remember over the series before this was Ruth. And a whole lot of Ruth is about gathering wheat to make flour so that they can eat. Because without it, Ruth will not survive. So Boaz shows his caring nature by leaving grain for her to take so that she can make bread. It's kind of a basic of what people need to eat. Next up, you need water. And this is a very little bottle. You need a lot more water than this for that amount of flour. But, as an example, you need water. Now, again, when Jesus talks about water, he talks about, come to me all who are thirsty, and I can give you the water of life. And in bread, there is that water as well, as there is in everything that we have. So it's really necessary to have the water as well. Now, does anybody else know an ingredient of bread? Yeast. I'll take the yeast first. I'll take the salt next. Right, yeast. Now, this is a very little packet of yeast. Now, yeast is great stuff. Now, normally, when you're making bread, you actually activate it first, just to make sure that it's going to start bubbling. You often add sugar, just to make sure, again, it keeps the bubble. But I'm just doing the 4-ingredient one rather than you can enhance your dough in all kinds of ways. And in fact, the pictures that you saw before, there were lots of enhancements. Oh, not this one yet. Sorry. We've got this, you activate it, and it bubbles. Now, yeast is a very unusual, well, not a totally unusual, quite an unusual thing because it activates both aerobically, which is with oxygen, and anaerobically, without oxygen. And if it's in the places that you want it, it tends to be aerobically. And if it's in places that you didn't want it, if you ever had a yeast infection, that's anaerobic. It doesn't like, it'll happily grow in the places you really didn't want yeast to grow. But you activate it. And one of the reasons that you activate it is because when you add this, the salt, if it's in too great a quantity, can actually kill the yeast. And that really isn't what you want when you start your bread making, because you're going to be at a loss. So the salt is added. Often when you read recipes, it'll say, add the salt over this side and the yeast over that side. The other option is to activate the yeast. Once the yeast is activated, the salt isn't, unless you add phenomenal amounts of salt, doesn't matter. But Jesus again talks to us about being salt. So when you think about salt in your bread, it does give it taste, it gives it that crust. But we're told to be salt and light in this world. So again, it's that idea that in bread, there are a whole load of things that come together that are the things that you need to think about with Jesus. So, next slide. I did think about making dough on the stage. I thought that'd be quite fun. But then I thought, actually, this kind of talk does bring two of my favourite things together. One, talking about Jesus, and two, baking. Anyone who knows me knows that I bake quite a lot. So all the breads that you saw earlier were ones that I've made. But as anyone who is British here will understand, is there's one that, in the Blue Peter turn of phrase, one I made earlier. Now, would anyone like to try some? No? You sure? It's quite nice. Admittedly, it's actually not the bread that we're going to eat later, because I was really organised this morning and I made the bread. But I then got overexcited and cooked all the dough rather than leaving any, so I had to get some out of the freezer instead. So this is a different type of dough than we're actually eating. This is a pizza dough, because we now have a pizza oven, just to make chaos more. But I would not... I'm not going to start doing that, are you? Yeah, how to put myself off there. We can't... It's actually it's a double mix, it's a double batch. So, but it's great stuff. You can kind of pull it to where you need it, it'll rise. It's great, but totally horrible like this. Really, really horrible to eat. Instead, I do have one I made earlier, a bread. To keep with the theme of Turkey being the country that eats the most bread, it's Turkish flatbread. It has yogurt in this one, just for anybody who'd like the recipe. It's really good stuff. It blows up as it cooks. But this is the kind of bread that Jesus would have been more familiar with. He would have been more familiar with flatbreads, because in 2,000 years ago, they knew how yeast worked, they knew how it all worked, but that idea of yeast would have taken forever to expand. And we'll come on to that a little bit later, of one of the things that happen with yeast. So, we're now up to our bread, which is great. But Jesus actually tells us to watch out for a couple of things. Next one. Right, so I don't know if anybody else had one of these during lockdown. No? Anyone know what it is? Sourdough starter, indeed. It went a little bit loopy this day. I think we must have wanted to build it up because we were making something. And we must have been prepared for the fact that, because it's actually on a saucer, that's quite unusual for our house. But it bubbles up. It's a really exciting thing to watch bubble. Now, this was our original starter. And my daughter fed it, and we looked after it, and yeah, it just kept going over COVID. We made so much bread. But then we got a little bit bored almost of making bread quite so much. And one day I went to the starter and it had flies in it. And I went, oh, it's gone. And she was very upset when she came home to discover I'd thrown it away. But I went, no, can't do it with flies. But that's the thing, sometimes yeast goes bad. So, next slide. Jesus actually tells us to watch out for this. In Matthew 16:5-12, he goes, when they went across the lake, the disciples forgot to take bread. Be careful, Jesus said to them, be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. They discussed this among themselves and said, is it because we didn't bring any bread? Really? So, aware of their discussion, Jesus asked, you have little faith. Why are you talking among yourselves about having no bread? Do you still not understand? Do you not remember the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many basketfuls you gathered? Or the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many basketfuls you gathered? How is it you don't understand that I was not talking to you about the bread? But be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Then they understand he's not turned to guard against the yeast used in bread, but against the teaching of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Now, why do I bring that up at this point? Because for this whole I Am series, it's revealing that we do have to be on our guard against things. We have to realise that Jesus says he's the bread because he wants us to go to him. But there are so many other sources that could feed you. You can have things that aren't good for you. And, you know, how often nowadays do we stroll through things and get lost in a rabbit hole of videos that aren't entirely uplifting for us? How often do we do this? And it's how often we need to stop for a minute and think about how in order to focus on Jesus, we need to take the rest out. We need to not be worried about somebody who's told us that we can't do X because we're a Christian, or Y. We need to go to the source every time. Each time we need to look back at that source many of us will have started when we became Christians using a Bible reading notes called Daily Bread. We need to go back to that daily bread, that daily source of food from Jesus. Right, so what mention is made of bread in the Bible? So in the Old Testament, which will be the next slide, right, there are certain let's be honest here. There are so many references to bread. If I started now at the beginning of the Bible, we would be here at 10 o'clock still going through references. And I think most of you have probably got something else you'd like to do than listen to me for that long, and I have to pack. So, manna. We've all heard the expression manna from heaven, and that happens in Exodus 16, where God provides bread for the Israelites, giving them that provision of food. Now, if you read onwards, they aren't actually overly impressed just to have bread. But that's what God gave them. He gave them bread. He did give them quail as well eventually, because they moaned so much. But when we get that provision from God, that manna from heaven, a showbread prescribed in Leviticus 24, here loaves were placed in the tabernacle as a permanent offering to God, symbolizing that covenant and continuous presence that God has in the tabernacle. The unleavened bread, which I mentioned earlier, commanded in Exodus 12. This is a crucial part of the Passover meal. So still, many Jews on Passover will actually remove any flour and yeast from their house. Well, they'll take the yeast. And they will have matzah instead of bread for that time. And I went to a Jewish school, and honestly, the amount of work that went into cleaning kitchens, I suppose it could almost have been the Great Spring Clean. Everything was cleaned, everything was covered, everything, so that nothing, at no point did the yeast get into what they were eating that week. But that lack of leaven, that lack of yeast, basically, as I said before, yeast takes a while to grow. And in those times, they didn't have the fast-acting yeast that we have. So therefore, they had to wait for it to grow. And it would take longer than they had. And God needed them to move. So it's often described as a symbol of sinlessness to be unleavened. And I thought we'd just go to the very first reference, where in Genesis 3:19, God tells Adam that he's going to eat bread by the sweat of his face. Whereas God had provided the food, the provision every day for them in the Garden of Eden. If they weren't wanting to be there, they had to look after themselves and get the bread themselves. So, moving on to the New Testament, there's a slight shift in how bread is seen in the New Testament. I've alluded to it already. Bread represents the spiritual food necessary for a believer's life, similar to how it was seen in the Old Testament. And Jesus has a concern to feed the spiritual as well as the physical and spiritual need of the crowd. Jesus says, "I am the bread." He proclaims himself to be the bread of life, the source of spiritual nourishment, providing eternal life, contrasting it with the manna of his ancestors. Now, the "I am the bread of life" statement comes in John 6. The beginning of John 6 is the feeding of the 5,000. So the five loaves of bread and the 2 fish. I've kept saying fishes every time I've said this because that's the song. So it's that progression that Jesus feeds the 5,000. He feeds them. He gives them more than they need. There are baskets and baskets of stuff to collect afterwards, which is really impressive. And as he goes to the disciples, all very well. Yes, I've provided a physical food. Yes, of course, I give the physical food. But unless you come to me, unless you feed on the bread that I am giving you, that spiritual bread of life, then you will not move. You will not be able to do anything. I give you that eternal life because you want to eat of my bread. We are going to do the Lord's Supper in a little while. where Jesus breaks the bread and says to them, "This is my body, which I share for you." It establishes that amazing ordinance that we celebrate together on a regular basis of eating bread and wine together, a sharing of a food from to represent that coming together that Jesus did. And then finally, which we are also going to do later, the act of bread symbolises that reconciliation. It's hard to break bread with somebody that you're really annoyed with. You need to, first of all, make sure you're okay with them, because it's easier to eat together if you're happy. And that responsibility that the early church had to come together and experience that caring for one another, that loving one another, that being together for one another. Next one. Jesus said, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty." Next one. Jesus has flipped the narrative. No longer is it just about a provision of food. It is a desire for eternal life. Just put that in your mind for a second. No longer is bread just physical. Yes, Jesus will give you bread, physical bread if you need it, but it's about eternal life. It's about how do we move forward with Jesus? How do we move forward in knowing Jesus more, in serving Jesus more, in being like Jesus more? How do we do that? Now, I'm probably not going to answer all the questions today, because that would be possibly a bit too much. Wasn't quite the remit Tommy gave me. But his desire for us to have the bread of life is for us not to live for today only. But as we'll sing a little bit later, we're living for today, tomorrow, and forever. It is today, tomorrow, and forever if you eat the bread of Jesus. Today, tomorrow, and forever. Keep feeding from that source. Next, as I say, Jesus said, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty."